Before we start, don't forget to hit that like button. Our goal is to reach 500 likes on this video, and with your support, we can make it happen. Now, let's dive straight into the entire history of medieval Scotland. Celtic roots, tribes, clans, and the land of Alba. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. Rolling green hills, dark forests, and mist curling off rugged mountains. Now, imagine it without castles, without stone fortresses, without Bruce or Wallace. Long before medieval Scotland, this was a land of tribes, bound not by kings but by blood and loyalty. This is Scotland's Celtic roots, the wild beginning of Alba. Back then, identity wasn't tied to a flag or government. It was tied to clan, kin, and land. These tribes were tough and resourceful, farming small plots, raising cattle, hunting, and fishing. The land shaped them harsh winters, fertile valleys, mountains dividing one group from another. Survival meant endurance, and that endurance became their culture. Society was built around clans, more than families. A clan was identity, loyalty, and protection. Betrayal was unthinkable. You knew who'd fight beside you, whose hearth you'd share in a storm. Kinship defined your place in the world and echoed long after the tribes themselves faded. Now, when we say Celts, it's easy to imagine one people. In truth, Celtic culture was a patchwork across Europe. In Scotland, tribes spoke languages that evolved into Gaelic, left carvings, stones, and oral traditions. Warriors painted themselves, carried spears and shields, and lived in fortified hilltop settlements. Crannogs and brocks perched on lakes or rises were both homes and defences. Small castles before castles. Religion touched everything. The world was alive with spirits. Groves, stones, and rivers carried meaning. Druids, priests, judges, storytellers held great power. By firelight, myths of idols and heroes explained thunder, harvest, and death. Those stories endured even after Christianity arrived with Saint Columba, but that's for later. The tribes weren't always united. They fought one another over grazing or honour. Yet when greater threats loomed like Roman armies pressing north, they came together. Fierce independence paired with fierce defence of the land would define Scotland for centuries. The Romans never conquered all of Scotland, but their presence shaped identity. Northern warriors, the Picts, painted and tattooed, became legends. Before Picts and Scots entered history, earlier Celtic clans laid Scotland's foundations. Much of that culture still echoes. Clan loyalty never disappeared. Identity tied to land still runs deep. Storytelling, history, and myth trace back to these roots. So when we talk about medieval Scotland's castles, kings, and battles, it starts here, in Alba's mist, among tribes carving life against the odds. They weren't building kingdoms yet, but they forged kinship, resilience, and independence that held Scotland through centuries of strife. And soon, strangers would knock at their borders. Romans, Vikings, Normans, English kings. Yet the spirit of the Celtic tribes never vanished. It adapted, reshaped, and endured like the land itself. Romans at the edge, Hadrian's wall, and the wild north. Imagine standing on a windswept ridge, staring at a wall stretching across the land as far as you can see. Cold stone cutting through hills, guarded by soldiers who probably wondered why they'd been sent to the edge of the world. That was Hadrian's wall. and beyond it lay the wild North Scotland, a place Rome never truly tamed. The year is 122. The Roman Empire is at its height. Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and decided something had to be done. His legions could march and build. But Caledonia, Scotland's old name, was impossible to conquer. The tribes were fierce and mobile, fighting for rugged homelands. So Hadrian drew a line. Instead of endless campaigns, he built a wall. It stretched 73 miles from coast to coast. Stone blocks piled high, a ditch in front. Forts every mile with Roman troops. Behind it were roads, supply bases, even towns supporting the garrisons. It wasn't just a wall, it was a living frontier. But it wasn't only defense. It was control, pride, propaganda, a statement. This far, and no further. Beyond lay chaos, the untamed north, home of tribes like the Picts who'd shape Scotland's story. Life along the wall was strange. Soldiers came from Spain, Syria, North Africa. Imagine a man from the Mediterranean, shivering under Scottish rain, staring into mist. They brought food, customs, and idols. Archaeologists have found altars, carvings, shoes, taverns, and markets popped up, sometimes cooperation, sometimes conflict. Yet the wall was never perfect. Northern tribes mastered hit and run raids, vanishing before capture. A generation later, Emperor Antoninus Pius tried again, building the Antonine Wall near modern Glasgow, but it failed. Rome fell back to Hadrian's Wall. Caledonia was too stubborn to be conquered. That defiance shaped Scotland's identity. Unlike most of Europe, it stayed outside Rome's control. The tribes, ancestors of Picts and Scots, saw the wall not as their limit, but as proof of strength. The mighty empire could not break them. Later legends drew pride from this. Freedom was worth clinging to against impossible odds. Today, Hadrian's Wall survives mostly in ruins, stones stolen for farms and churches. But in its prime, it was a marvel. And even now, it carries the memory of empire facing wilderness. Remember Scotland's Celtic roots. These are the same people Rome tried to stop. And later, when Picts and Scots unite, their resistance to Rome becomes the foundation of their kingdom. Stand by the windswept stones today, and you can almost hear echoes. Roman boots, tribal war cries, and the silence of a north that refused to bow. Scotland remained untamed, waiting for its own kings, castles, and battles to rise. Picts and Scots, two peoples, one emerging kingdom. Imagine living in a land where your closest neighbours weren't just rivals, they were practically from another world. Strange symbols carved into stone, warriors painted in swirling blue designs, and kings who ruled from hill forts. That was the world of the Picts. And then, across the sea from Ireland, came the Scots, bold settlers carving out their own foothold in the rugged west. For centuries, these two peoples eyed each other warily, fought bitterly, but also slowly, almost reluctantly, began weaving their destinies together. The Picts were the mystery people of the north. Even their name came from outsiders, the Romans, who called them the Painted Ones. They spoke a language now lost and left carved stones marked with symbols scholars still debate. Their strongholds dotted the land from the Grampians to the Northern Isles. Fierce warriors defended their territories, but kingship was unstable. Power shifted between families, rooted in tradition, yet often fragile. The Scots came from across the Irish Sea, from Dalriada in Northern Ireland. Seafarers at heart, they brought Gaelic, their customs, and fierce independence. By the 5th and 6th centuries, they had settled in Argyll and the Western Isles. While Picts looked inland, the Scots looked outward, their ships braving seas few dared. At first, they clashed raids, battles, shifting alliances, yet constant threats pushed them toward uneasy cooperation. The Romans had once tried to break the north with Hadrian's Wall, and later Antonine's Wall, but failed. The memory of such foes lingered. Then came Viking raids, hammering both Picts and Scots. Facing survival, rivals began to see common cause. Religion also bridged divides. Saint Columba, an Irish monk on Iona in the 6th century, brought Christianity to both peoples. His mission created shared values and networks. Kings sought the Church's blessing to legitimize rule, while monks wrote stories blending traditions. Faith gave Picts and Scots a reason to stand side by side. Still, unity was slow. For centuries, Pictish kings ruled proudly, while Scottish lords in Dalriada grew stronger. Sometimes Scots pushed east, sometimes Picts drove them back. The rugged landscape itself, mountains, rivers, wild forests, slowed the blending of cultures. Then the Viking storm of the 8th and 9th centuries changed everything. Pictish strongholds burned, Scottish coasts raided, monasteries looted. Old rivalries mattered less than survival. Against the Norse, Picts and Scots discovered they were stronger together. This slow merging of cultures set the stage for Kenneth MacAlpin in the 9th century. His rise to power is often told as the moment Scotland was truly born, when Pict and Scot became one kingdom. But the truth is more complex. Kenneth didn't create unity out of nothing. He built upon centuries of blood, faith, and necessity. The two peoples had already been inching toward each other, their fates tangled by war, marriage alliances, and shared struggle. Kenneth simply gave form to what had been building all along. Think about it. Without the Picts, Scotland wouldn't have its foundation of deep-rooted native strength. Without the Scots, it wouldn't have inherited the Gaelic language and seafaring vision that shaped so much of its culture. Together, they became something new, something that could endure Viking raids, challenge mighty England to the south, and eventually carve its name onto the map of Europe. So when we talk about the Picts and the Scots, it's not just a story of conflict. It's a story of unlikely partners pushed together by fate, of two distinct peoples who, in the end, forged one kingdom out of necessity and ambition. And as we'll see later, when Kenneth MacAlpin takes centre stage, that fragile unity would become the very heart of Scotland's medieval identity, a kingdom born out of difference, yet destined to endure. Saint Columba and the spread of Christianity. Picture the cold winds sweeping across the rugged shores of western Scotland. The sea is restless, crashing against black rocks, while tiny boats of leather and wood fight the waves. On one of those boats, in the year 563, sat a tall Irish monk with piercing eyes and a determined spirit. His name was Columba, and though he carried only books, faith, and companions, he would forever change the soul of Scotland. Columba's journey began in conflict. In Ireland, disputes drew him into bloodshed. Some say he left as penance, others in exile. But what mattered was what followed. He landed on Iona, a rocky scrap off Scotland's coast that became the cradle of a new spiritual age. From that island, Christianity spread like ripples across water. Picture it: wooden huts around a small chapel, monks on barley bread and fish, scratching prayers into parchment. Columba and his brothers rode dangerous seas to reach tribes still devoted to old idols of stone and tree. To locals, these rough-robed strangers, preaching one idol above all, seemed absurd at first. But Columba wasn't just a preacher, he was a storyteller. He spoke in ways clans understood, weaving faith into their love of courage, loyalty, and kinship. Legends rose around him, calming storms, healing the sick, even facing a great beast in the River Ness, the earliest tale of the Loch Ness Monster. Whether miracle or myth, the story spread, and so did his reputation. From Iona, Christianity seeped into the Highlands. Kings saw more than belief, they saw politics. A Christian ruler could connect with Ireland, England, even Rome. Columba baptized kings, blessed warriors, and copied sacred texts that gave rulers divine authority. He even met Bride, king of the Picts, at his fortress near Inverness. No one knows their words, but afterward Christianity gained a foothold. The fragile seeds of unity between Picts and Scots were planted with faith as the thread. Iona became legendary. Pilgrims came from across Europe. Kings of Scotland, Norway, and Ireland were buried there. Stone crosses marked its graveyards, a holy heart of the land. Vikings later stormed its shores, burning even holy sites. Yet Columba's legacy endured. His monks scattered, founding monasteries, carrying the written word and blending Celtic traditions with Christian belief, a legacy that reshaped Scotland. Think about it this way: without Columba, Scotland's story would have been very different. A land of fierce clans and warriors might never have found a shared spiritual centre. His mission brought not just a religion, but a culture of learning, writing, and connection to a larger world. He took a rocky outcrop in the sea and turned it into a beacon. Columba died in the year 597, kneeling in prayer in his little chapel on Iona. The monks who loved him wrote down his deeds, and those writings carried his memory far beyond the waves that once carried him from Ireland. His journey began in conflict, but it ended with a peace that reshaped a nation. When we talk about the castles, kings, and battles of Scotland later, remember this monk on his windswept island. Because long before the walls of Bannockburn shook with war cries, and long before Mary, Queen of Scots, faced her tragic fate, Columba had already given Scotland something that no army could: a soul tied to faith, story, and the promise of something greater than the sword. Vikings arrive, raiders, settlers, and sea kings. Picture this. You're living in a quiet coastal village in the north of Scotland, the waves lapping gently at the shore, when suddenly the horizon fills with dragon-headed ships. The sails are striped, the oars cut through the water in perfect rhythm, and before you even have time to shout a warning, fierce warriors leap onto the sand, axes in hand. That's how the Viking story in Scotland begins, with terror, fire, and the unknown crashing into everyday life. The first Viking raids hit the British Isles in the late 8th century. One of the earliest and most infamous was in the year 793, when Norse raiders attacked Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. Word of that horror spread quickly, and Scotland, lying even closer to Scandinavia across the North Sea, soon found itself in the firing line. The Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, were the first to feel the Viking storm. Their monasteries, rich with silver, books, and treasures, became irresistible targets. But the Vikings weren't just raiders. That's the surprising part. Yes, they came with swords and axes, but they also came with families, cattle, and ambitions for new homes. Over time, they didn't just plunder the islands and coasts they stayed. They built farmsteads, carved out kingdoms, and reshaped the culture of northern Scotland. Orkney and Shetland especially became strongholds of Norse influence. In fact, for centuries these islands were more Scandinavian than Scottish, ruled by powerful jarls who owed their allegiance to Norway. Imagine being a native Pict or Scot living in those regions at the time. One moment you belong to a local clan with its own traditions, and the next you're forced to live alongside foreigners who speak a different tongue, worship idols like Odin and Thor, and carve runes into stone instead of crosses. Conflict was inevitable, but so was exchange. Slowly, intermarriage and trade began weaving these worlds together. Place names still carry the mark of those settlers' names ending in Ness, Dale, or Stir reveal Viking roots that never faded. The Vikings didn't stop at the islands. They pushed into the Hebrides and the western seaboard, where they became sea kings rulers whose power was not based on castles or farmland, but on fleets of longships. Control of the sea was everything. Whoever ruled the waters ruled the trade, the raids, and the lifeblood of coastal communities. The Kingdom of the Isles emerged, a realm stretching across the Hebrides and even reaching into Ireland at times. Yet, as terrifying as they were, the Vikings also helped knit Scotland into a wider northern world. Their ships connected Scotland not only with Norway and Denmark, but with distant places as far as Iceland, Greenland, and even the edge of North America. Along with goods and people came ideas. The blending of cultures would eventually play a huge role in shaping the identity of medieval Scotland. Of course, clashes with the existing powers of Scotland were frequent. The Picts tried to resist, but the Viking presence was relentless. By the time Kenneth MacAlpin rose to unite the Scots and Picts, a story I'll tell later, the Norse threat was a constant force pressing at the edges of his realm. Some kings tried to fight back, others made uneasy truces, but no one could ignore the Norsemen. Take Orkney again as an example. The jarls there became so powerful that they weren't just local rulers, they were major players in the politics of Scotland, Ireland, and Norway all at once. For a long time, these islands were effectively outside Scottish control. Only centuries later would they finally be drawn firmly into the Scottish crown's grasp. There's also the personal side of the Viking story. The everyday settlers who brought with them new farming techniques, new styles of dress, and even new words that slipped into the Scots' vocabulary. While warriors and jarls dominate the chronicles, it's the quiet persistence of those who stayed raising families, tending livestock, blending with local clans that left the deepest mark on Scotland. So, were the Vikings simply brutal raiders? Not quite. They were that, certainly, but they were also settlers, rulers, and traders who became part of Scotland's story. Their arrival shattered the old world, but also laid foundations for a new one. And the funny thing is, the Viking shadow never fully faded. Even today, in Orkney festivals, Shetland place names, and Hebridean traditions, echoes of those sea kings still live on. The next time we talk about Kenneth MacAlpin and the birth of a united Scotland, you'll see just how much this Viking pressure shaped the need for unity in the first place. Because without those dragon ships on the horizon, the story of Scotland might have unfolded very differently. Kenneth MacAlpin and the birth of a united Scotland. Imagine a land divided not just by mountains and rivers, but by people who saw themselves as entirely separate. On one side, the Picts, with their painted warriors and mysterious carved stones. On the other, the Scots, Gaelic-speaking settlers who had come across the sea from Ireland. For centuries, these groups lived in uneasy balance, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting. And yet, out of this rivalry would come a single kingdom, a moment that many see as the true birth of Scotland. At the centre of it all stands one man, Kenneth MacAlpin. Kenneth wasn't just another warlord. He was clever, patient, and ambitious in ways that set him apart. His story is wrapped in legend, but underneath the myths lies a turning point in history. He was the king of Dalriada, the Scots kingdom in the west. Across the mountains lay Pictland, powerful but fragmented. The Picts had traditions very different from the Scots. Even their kingship followed a matrilineal line, meaning descent through the mother's side. Yet by the mid-9th century, something was shifting. External threats pressed hard on both peoples. The Vikings had arrived. Those fearsome raiders from across the sea weren't content with plunder alone. They wanted land. They struck monasteries, towns, and farms, tearing at the fragile balance of power. Both the Scots and the Picts were vulnerable. Fighting each other while facing the Norsemen would have been a death sentence. Unity became not just a dream, but a necessity. And here's where Kenneth steps in. According to legend, he tricked the Pictish nobles during a feast, massacring them and seizing control. It's a dramatic story, often called the treachery of Scone. But historians believe the truth was less theatrical. Rather than a bloody banquet, it was more likely careful alliances, dynastic claims, and political marriages that allowed Kenneth to unite the crowns. The myths tell us something important, though. Even in later centuries, people wanted to believe the birth of Scotland came with high drama, as if destiny demanded it. Once Kenneth gained authority over both Scots and Picts, he began forging a new identity. He moved the centre of power to Scone, where the Stone of Destiny became the symbol of kingship. That sacred block of sandstone would be used to inaugurate Scottish kings for centuries. Even Edward I of England later carried it off in his attempt to claim Scotland. But that's a story for much later. For Kenneth, Scone was a place where traditions could merge, where a new kingdom could take root. This union wasn't easy. The Picts didn't simply vanish, though in later centuries their culture and language would fade, absorbed into Gaelic Scotland. For a time, though, the kingdom was a patchwork, and Kenneth had to balance different customs and loyalties. But he laid the foundation of Alba, the name that would become the heart of the medieval Scottish kingdom. Think about what this meant. Instead of scattered tribes constantly vulnerable to Viking raids or Anglo-Saxon pressure from the south, Kenneth created something larger, something more resilient. The Kingdom of Alba became a player in the wider politics of Britain. It was still fragile, yes, but it had a shape, a voice, and a sense of shared future. Kenneth's death in the year 858 didn't unravel his work. His descendants carried on, sometimes fighting among themselves, sometimes struggling to hold the kingdom together, but the idea of a united Scotland had taken root. Later kings would expand it, strengthen it, and give it castles and armies. But Kenneth MacAlpin was remembered as the one who planted the seed. And even centuries later, storytellers loved to return to that image of him, the cunning king who brought together two peoples and gave them a single destiny. Some called him the first king of Scots, others the first king of Alba. Either way, his reign marks the turning of a page. From this point on, we're no longer talking about scattered tribes and rival peoples. We're talking about a kingdom. It's fascinating, isn't it? How much of a nation's identity can be tied to one figure, half history, half legend? Kenneth MacAlpin may not have slain Pictish nobles at a feast, but he achieved something far greater. He began the story of Scotland as one people. And that story would be tested again and again by Vikings, by English kings, and even by the endless rivalries of its own clans. But it all begins here, with Kenneth and the birth of Alba, the land we now call Scotland, the rise of Alba, early kings and fragile unity. Picture a land of misty hills, dark forests, and scattered kingdoms, each ruled by a proud chieftain who trusted no one but his kin. This was Scotland in the 9th and 10th centuries, a patchwork of tribes and peoples who shared borders but not loyalties. And yet, from this fractured world, something remarkable began to take shape. The Kingdom of Alba, the first flickering image of what would one day be Scotland. The story begins after Kenneth MacAlpin, the king we already talked about, united the Scots and Picts under one crown. His achievement was massive, but it was also fragile, like a fire just starting to catch. The kings who came after him inherited a throne that was far from secure. Imagine trying to hold together clans that spoke different languages, prayed in different ways, and held centuries of grudges against each other. One wrong move, and the whole kingdom could splinter apart. The word Alba itself is fascinating. It comes from an older name that simply meant the land or the island. But under these early kings, it began to mean a new political identity. Instead of thinking of themselves only as Picts or Scots or Britons, more and more people began to see themselves as part of Alba. Of course, not everyone agreed. Rivalries ran deep, and many leaders only accepted unity when it benefited them. Still, the seed of Scotland had been planted. Take King Constantine II, for example. He ruled in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, and spent much of his reign trying to protect Alba from outside threats. The Vikings were still a constant danger, raiding coasts and pushing inland when they could. At the same time, powerful English kings to the south wanted to pull northern lands under their influence. Constantine had to balance diplomacy, war, and alliance building just to keep Alba intact. In the famous Battle of Brunanburh in the year 937, Constantine allied with other rulers against the English king Athelstan. The battle was brutal and costly. And although the English claimed victory, the fact that Alba stood as a recognized power was proof of how far it had come. But unity wasn't just about battles, it was also about symbols and faith. Christianity, which had spread earlier through missionaries like Saint Columba, became a vital glue. The church offered a shared belief system that crossed clan lines. Kings worked closely with bishops and abbots, using the church not only to guide souls but also to strengthen their authority. When people prayed in the same way, celebrated the same holy days, and respected the same saints, it gave Alba a common thread in a world that otherwise felt divided. Still, let's not imagine Alba as some peaceful kingdom where everyone suddenly held hands. Power struggles were constant. Succession was tricky, often leading to rival claims between brothers, cousins, and uncles. Assassinations and betrayals were not rare. You might wake up as king one morning and find yourself betrayed by your kin before the year was out. The unity of Alba was always fragile, always on the edge of breaking apart. Yet out of this chaos grew something lasting. Over time, Alba developed its own style of kingship. castles began to appear as centres of control. Kings travelled across their lands, holding court, hearing disputes, and reminding local lords that they ruled by royal favour. It was a slow process, but each generation pushed Alba closer to being more than just a name, closer to being a real kingdom with structure and strength. What makes this period so gripping is how uncertain it all was. When you look back now, knowing Scotland survived and thrived, it's tempting to think it was inevitable, but it wasn't. The early kings of Alba had to fight tooth and nail, not just against enemies on the battlefield, but against the constant threat of their own people breaking away. And remember, when we later talk about Macbeth and the Stewarts, this fragile foundation of Alba is what they inherited. Without these early kings holding the line, there would have been no Scotland for them to rule. So, the rise of Alba wasn't a dramatic explosion of power, but a slow, often painful stitching together of tribes, faith, and ambition. It was fragile unity, yes, but it was enough to survive. And that survival gave Scotland its first true sense of being a nation, one that no wall, no empire, and no invader could ever fully erase. Castles of stone, power centres across the Highlands and Lowlands. Picture yourself standing in the shadow of a towering stone wall, the wind howling through the battlements, the smell of smoke from the great hall drifting into the cold air. Castles weren't just buildings, they were statements. Symbols of dominance, safety, and ambition. In medieval Scotland, they rose from rugged hillsides, guarded river crossings, and watched over fertile farmland. To the people who lived beneath their looming presence, these castles weren't just homes for lords, they were power centres that shaped every corner of life in both the Highlands and the Lowlands. The earliest strongholds weren't the grand castles of fairy tales. They were simple wooden motte and bailey structures, brought over by Norman influence. After the 11th century, a mound of earth with a timber fort on top, a fenced enclosure below, and perhaps a ditch for protection. Crude, yes, but effective. Over time, wood gave way to stone, and suddenly, Scotland's landscape began to sprout towers and keeps that looked as if they could stand forever. In the Lowlands, castles like Edinburgh and Stirling dominated key routes. Whoever held these strongholds could control movement between north and south. Think of Stirling Castle perched on its volcanic rock, overlooking the River Forth. If you wanted to march an army through Scotland, you had to deal with Stirling first. It's no accident that so many battles, like Bannockburn, happened right in its shadow. These lowland castles became centres of administration too, where taxes were collected, justice was handed out, and royal authority was displayed in stone. The Highlands told a different story. Here, clan chiefs ruled lands that were wild, fragmented, and fiercely independent. Their castles were often smaller, perched on rocky outcrops or tiny islands in lochs. Eilean Donan, for instance, looks like it was born out of the landscape itself, standing guard over the sea lochs of Kintail. These castles weren't designed just to impress, they were refuges. When rival clans came raiding, a stone tower rising from an island could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Life inside these castles was a mix of hardship and grandeur. Great halls echoed with feasts, music, and political bargains whispered over cups of ale. But the stone walls were cold, draughty, and damp. Smoke from central hearths blackened the ceilings. Servants scurried through passageways while lords plotted alliances, marriages, and sometimes betrayals. Outside, villagers toiled in the fields, knowing that the castle's walls offered both protection in times of war and authority in times of peace. Castles were also symbols. To build in stone was to declare permanence. Wooden halls could burn, but stone towers told your enemies and your neighbours that you were here to stay. Each new curtain wall or fortified gate was a declaration of wealth and ambition. It's no wonder kings and nobles poured fortunes into these projects, even when the cost strained their treasuries. Wars tested these fortresses again and again. During the Wars of Independence, castles changed hands constantly. English garrisons occupied mighty fortresses like Edinburgh, only for daring Scottish raids sometimes carried out by men scaling the walls in the dead of night to take them back. Robert the Bruce famously ordered many castles destroyed rather than risk them falling back into English hands. Better rubble than submission. Those ruins still scar the landscape, silent reminders of desperate times. But castles weren't just for war. They became centres of politics, culture, and even identity. The Stewart kings expanded palaces like Linlithgow, turning stark fortresses into residences fit for European royalty. Here, stone was reshaped into elegance, with ornate windows and gardens that spoke of prestige rather than just defence. Castles evolved from military bastions into symbols of national pride and dynastic power. Still, in the Highlands, the clan strongholds retained their rugged practicality. While lowland lords looked toward Europe for inspiration, Highland chiefs remained tied to their kin and their land. Their castles reflected that not grand palaces, but hard, weather-beaten defences against both neighbours and nature. This contrast between highlands and lowlands, between rough towers and polished palaces, mirrored the deeper divide in Scottish society itself. Even today, when tourists wander through ruined halls or gaze up at jagged towers against the sky, those castles still speak. They whisper stories of sieges, of lords and ladies, of everyday folk who lived in their shadows. They remind us that Scotland's history was written not just in battles, but in stone walls that stood against time, weather, and war. And as we move deeper into Scotland's story, these castles will continue to appear, each one a silent witness to the shifting tides of kings, clans, and kingdoms. Macbeth. The real story behind the legend. Say the name Macbeth, and most people think of witches, daggers, and Shakespeare's cursed play. A ruthless tyrant, haunted by guilt, who murdered his way to the throne. But what if I told you the real Macbeth of Scotland was nothing like the blood-soaked villain of the stage? What if he was, in truth, a respected king who brought stability, law, and even hope to his troubled land? Let's start with the basics. Macbeth was born around the beginning of the 11th century, into a world of clan rivalries and shifting loyalties. His father was a powerful figure in Moray, in the north of Scotland, and his mother may have had royal connections. So from the very start, Macbeth wasn't some outsider clawing his way up. He had blood ties to the Scottish throne. That mattered in a time when kingship was not simply passed from father to son, but often claimed by whoever had the strongest mix of lineage, allies, and force. Now remember when we spoke of the endless clan rivalries tearing Scotland apart? Macbeth grew up right in the middle of that. In fact, his father was killed when Macbeth was still young, and that left him with a personal understanding of just how dangerous power could be. He married Gruch, a widow with royal blood of her own, and that alliance strengthened his claim to rule. Far from being the scheming Lady Macbeth of Shakespeare's imagination, Gruach was a woman of her time. Her marriage was a strategic bond that gave Macbeth legitimacy. So how did he become king? In 1040, Duncan I, who was the reigning king, launched an attack into Moray, Macbeth's territory. But Duncan was no noble victim as Shakespeare painted him. He was a young, reckless king whose campaigns were straining his realm. At the Battle of Pitgavany near Elgin, Macbeth's forces defeated Duncan's, and Duncan was killed in the fight. Macbeth was then crowned king, not as a murderer hiding in the shadows, but as the victor in open battle, a common way to claim kingship in medieval Scotland. What came next might surprise you. Macbeth ruled for 17 years, one of the longer and more stable reigns of that chaotic era. 17 years. Hardly the reign of a mad tyrant consumed by paranoia. He was remembered for promoting law and order, for supporting the church, and for encouraging learning. Some records even suggest he went on a pilgrimage to Rome. Imagine that the supposed butcher of Shakespearean fame, humbly walking among pilgrims in the heart of Christendom. That's not the portrait of a man gnawed by guilt and fear. But of course, peace in Scotland never lasted forever. Rival claims to the throne were always lurking, and the exiled sons of Duncan wanted their chance to return. Macbeth's main rival was Malcolm, Duncan's son, who fled to England after his father's death. And here's where the larger stage of history comes in. The English king, Edward the Confessor, gave Malcolm support, and together they plotted to take back the Scottish throne. In 1054, Macbeth faced Malcolm's forces at Dunsinane. Though the chronicles don't mention forests marching or witches chanting, the battle was fierce. And Macbeth was defeated, but not killed. He retreated north, still clinging to power, until Malcolm struck again the following year at Lumphanan. There, Macbeth was slain, and Malcolm Canmore claimed the throne. Shakespeare gave us a single bloody downfall, but in reality, Macbeth's fall was a drawn-out struggle, fought in 2 hard campaigns. So why the dark legend? Why did Shakespeare turn a respected king into a monster? The answer lies in politics. Shakespeare was writing during the reign of King James VI of Scotland, who had also become James I of England. James claimed descent from Banquo, a character Shakespeare turned into Macbeth's noble foil. Painting Macbeth as a villain and Banquo as the ancestor of kings was the perfect way to flatter James and his lineage. In other words, the tragedy of Macbeth was written less as history and more as royal propaganda. And yet, myths have power. Shakespeare's play etched an image of Macbeth into the world's imagination that no real chronicle could erase. But if you strip away the daggers, the ghostly visions, and the chanting witches, you find a very different man, a warrior, yes, but also a king who ruled wisely for nearly 2 decades in one of the most turbulent times of Scottish history. So next time you hear Macbeth's name, remember there's more to the story than a cursed play. There was a real king behind the legend, one who stood tall in the winds of clan rivalry, fought his battles in the open, and for a brief shining time gave Scotland a measure of peace. Norman influence, knights, feudal lords, and new traditions. Imagine walking through Scotland in the 11th century and suddenly seeing knights on horseback, covered head to toe in shining armour, banners fluttering in the wind. This was not the Scotland of old. It was a land in transition, absorbing a wave of foreign customs, laws, and ways of life brought by the Normans. The change didn't happen overnight, but when it did, Scotland would never quite be the same again. The Normans themselves were descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France, in a region that still bears their name, Normandy. By the time of William the Conqueror's invasion of England in the year 1066, they had become expert warriors, castle builders, and administrators. And as Norman power spread south into England, it also began to seep north into Scotland. One of the earliest sparks came through marriage and alliances. Scottish kings, especially Malcolm Canmore and his successors, began to invite Norman knights to their court. Why? Because these men brought not only military strength but also political loyalty, the kind that could help a king secure his throne in turbulent times. The Normans were rewarded with lands, titles, and privileges. Slowly, the landscape of Scottish nobility began to shift. With Norman lords came castles, and not the kind the Scots had known before. These were massive stone fortresses, symbols of dominance that could withstand sieges and project authority across the countryside. Think of places like Edinburgh Castle being rebuilt and reshaped with Norman influence. Suddenly, power wasn't just in clans or kinship ties, but in the ability to control territory through fortified strongholds. The feudal system followed. Before this, Scottish society had been based largely on kinship groups and tribal loyalty. The Normans introduced a more rigid structure, the king at the top granting land to nobles in exchange for military service, who in turn had vassals beneath them. This wasn't just politics, it was a whole new way of living, and it altered how ordinary people experienced life. Farmers who had once been tied to clans now found themselves bound to lords, owing rents and labour. Knighthood itself became a new ideal. The mounted warrior, sworn to his lord, clad in mail and carrying the code of chivalry, entered Scottish imagination. It wasn't only about warfare, but also about status and honour. A knight wasn't just a fighter. He was part of a new cultural identity that blended war with ceremony, loyalty, and prestige. And with the knights and lords came new traditions, language, names, even architecture. Families with Norman roots, such as the Bruces and the Stewarts, rose to prominence in Scotland. Remember Robert the Bruce? His very family name reveals this Norman heritage. The same applies to the Stewart dynasty that would eventually dominate Scottish politics and lead the nation into its royal zenith. Without Norman bloodlines and traditions, those later chapters of Scottish history would look very different. But it wasn't all smooth. Older Gaelic traditions and clan loyalties didn't simply vanish. In fact, Scotland became a fascinating blend, the Gaelic Highlands holding on to older ways, while the Lowlands closer to England became deeply marked by Norman culture. This division would create tensions that lasted centuries, shaping the identity of the nation. Religion, too, changed. The Normans brought closer ties to continental Europe and to the Roman Church. Monasteries were reorganized, bishops gained power, and new cathedrals rose across the land. It was part of a cultural shift that pulled Scotland further into the orbit of Europe, making it less isolated and more connected to the grand movements of the Middle Ages. Imagine being a farmer in this period, watching knights ride past your field, hearing Latin prayers in new stone churches, and noticing strange surnames like de Morville or de Bruce replacing the old Gaelic ones. It must have felt like the world was tilting the old ways still alive, but slowly giving ground to new customs. And yet, Scotland did not simply become Norman. Instead, it absorbed and reshaped Norman traditions to fit its own character. This was the genius of Scottish kings to take what worked, like castles and feudal loyalty, but still hold on to their independence and identity. That balance would be tested later, especially during the Wars of Independence when Norman-descended families like the Bruces and the Balliols fought for the throne. But that's a story I'll save for later. The Norman influence on Scotland was like a tide. Steady, unstoppable, but also absorbed into the sands of the land it touched. Knights, feudal lords, castles, and cathedrals all became part of the medieval Scottish landscape, and though centuries have passed, you can still see their legacy in the names, the ruins, and the traditions that survived. It's a reminder that Scotland's story was never one of isolation, but of constant connection, influence, and adaptation. And the Norman chapter, with all its knights and lords, was one of the most transformative waves to ever crash upon its shores. The Wars of Independence begin. Wallace and the spirit of freedom. Picture Scotland at the end of the 13th century. A land bruised and battered, its kingship in chaos, its people caught between loyalty and survival. The Scottish throne had fallen into dispute after the death of Alexander III, and the English king, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, saw an opportunity. He marched north, demanding homage, stripping Scotland of its independence piece by piece. Castles fell. Nobles bent the knee. It seemed Scotland might be swallowed whole. And then, out of nowhere, a figure rose who would embody the raw spirit of freedom. William Wallace. Wallace wasn't a nobleman. He didn't come from a royal line or a seat of power. He was, in many ways, an ordinary Scot, which made him extraordinary in a world where resistance usually came from lords and kings. His story begins not in grand halls, but in the countryside, with rumours of rebellion sparking after he struck down English soldiers who harassed him. Whether it was a personal feud, an act of self-defence, or the first spark of something larger, people rallied to him. Scotland needed a symbol, someone unafraid to fight back. Wallace became that symbol. His raids against English garrisons lit a fire across the land. Villagers, farmers, and disillusioned knights joined him. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about dignity, about not being crushed under a foreign king's boot. The defining moment came in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace and his ally Andrew Moray faced a far larger English force. The English knights, confident in their numbers, tried to cross the narrow bridge over the River Forth. Wallace held his men back, waiting, watching. Then, when half the English were across, he struck. The bridge became a death trap. English knights and soldiers were cut down or driven into the river. Against the odds, Wallace's outnumbered force achieved a stunning victory. That day changed everything. Wallace wasn't just a rebel anymore. He became guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent king. For a brief moment it seemed the tide had turned. The Scots had proven they could stand up to the might of England. But victories in medieval Scotland were rarely permanent. The following year, Edward I returned with a massive army. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Wallace's forces were crushed. Arrows rained down, English cavalry thundered forward, and the Scottish ranks broke. Wallace escaped, but his brief guardianship ended. Some nobles turned on him, blaming him for the loss. The dream of unity faltered, but the flame he had lit did not go out. Wallace became a fugitive, moving through forests and glens, evading capture while still inspiring resistance. Eventually, betrayal caught him. In 1305, he was captured, dragged to London, and put on trial for treason, though how could he betray a king he never swore loyalty to? His execution was brutal, meant as a warning. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. His body parts sent north as a grim reminder of English power. And yet, the opposite happened. Wallace's death didn't kill the spirit of freedom. It carved it into stone. He became a martyr, a legend, a story whispered by hearth fires. Children grew up hearing of his courage. Other leaders, most famously Robert the Bruce, would carry forward the struggle, leading to the victory at Bannockburn years later. But Wallace was the spark. Without him, perhaps there would have been no fire at all. Think about it. An ordinary man, not a king or a great noble, became the symbol of a nation's defiance. That's why his story has lived on, retold in chronicles, poems, and later in myths that stretched beyond truth. But at the heart of it all lies something very real, a moment when Scotland refused to bow, when the voice of a common man rose louder than the crowns of kings. The wars of independence didn't end with Wallace. They were only beginning. But his spirit, fierce, unyielding, unwilling to accept submission, became the heartbeat of Scotland's long fight for freedom. And long after castles crumbled and kings passed away, that heartbeat still echoed through the land. Robert the Bruce and the victory at Bannockburn. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the summer of 1314. The air is heavy with tension. Two armies stare at each other across the fields near Stirling. One side is massive, gleaming with English knights in shining armour, convinced they will crush the rebels once and for all. The other is smaller, rougher, made up of Scots who had spent years fighting a desperate war for freedom. At their head stands Robert the Bruce, a king who had fought, failed, and risen again. What happened here would decide the fate of Scotland. But to understand Bannockburn, we need to rewind. Robert the Bruce wasn't always the shining hero we think of today. He was a man torn between ambition and survival. Remember William Wallace, the fiery leader who sparked the first wave of resistance. After Wallace's fall, Scotland was fractured. Families like the Bruces and the Comyns fought not just against England but against each other. In fact, Robert secured his claim to the throne in 1306 by killing his rival, John Comyn, in a church, a shocking act that left him both excommunicated and hunted. Hardly the noble image of a saviour, right? At first, things went terribly for him. He was forced into hiding, his family captured or killed, and his cause looked doomed. But Bruce was nothing if not stubborn. From the shadows he rebuilt. Small victories grew into larger campaigns. He used the land itself as a weapon, launching ambushes, striking quickly, then vanishing into the hills. Slowly, the people rallied to him. By the time of Bannockburn, Bruce had transformed from fugitive to king, commanding not just loyalty but respect. The English, of course, were determined to crush him. King Edward II marched north with what was probably the largest English army ever sent into Scotland, packed with heavy cavalry, archers, and supplies. To the Scots, it must have looked like an unstoppable tide. Yet, Bruce didn't flinch. He chose his ground carefully, near Stirling, where the terrain of marshy ground and narrow passes could nullify the English advantage in numbers and cavalry. It was a gamble, but it was brilliant. And then came the moment that set the tone. On the eve of battle, an English knight named Henry de Bohun spotted Bruce riding ahead of his lines. Sensing glory, he charged at the Scottish king with a lance. Everyone held their breath. But Bruce, calm as ever, sidestepped, rose in his saddle, and with one perfect swing of his axe, split de Bohun's skull. The Scots roared. Their king had faced down a charging knight and lived. That single act of courage boosted morale in ways no speech ever could. The battle itself stretched over 2 days. The English knights, weighed down by their armour, charged into boggy ground where they became easy targets for the tightly packed Scottish schiltrons' formations of spearmen bristling like hedgehogs. English arrows rained down, but the marshes and confusion weakened their impact. Time and again, English forces tried to break through, and time and again they were pushed back. By the second day, the tide turned. The English army, exhausted and hemmed in, broke into chaos. Edward II himself barely escaped with his life. When the dust settled, the unthinkable had happened. A smaller, outnumbered Scottish army had defeated one of the mightiest forces in Europe. Bannockburn wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. Scotland would not be conquered. Robert the Bruce had secured more than a battlefield win. He had secured his people's belief in their independence. Of course, the war didn't end overnight. England would continue to press claims, and Scotland would still face political struggles. But Bannockburn was the turning point, the moment when the dream of freedom felt real. A generation later, it would be echoed in the Declaration of Arbroath, a bold statement that Scotland was a free nation and its people would rather die than live as slaves. Think back to Hadrian's Wall. Built centuries earlier as a line Rome could never push beyond. Bannockburn felt like that same spirit reborn, the wild north refusing to bow. And when later kings, like those of the Stewart dynasty, carried Scotland into new eras of power, they did so on the foundation Robert the Bruce had laid here. So, when you stand at Bannockburn today, the fields may look quiet, just grass and wind. But if you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of spears clashing, the roar of men fighting for freedom, and the steady heartbeat of a nation that refused to surrender. Scotland's fragile peace and endless clan rivalries. Imagine a land where the echo of battle never truly fades. The fields may fall quiet after one fight, but the tension in the air lingers like a storm waiting to break again. That was medieval Scotland. Even in moments of peace, the kingdom was never truly united. Beneath the crown's fragile authority, clans nursed grudges that went back generations. Family honour, land disputes, and ambition meant that swords were always close at hand, and the peace Scotland tried to build was as fragile as thin ice under heavy boots. The wars of independence had given Scotland a sense of national pride, especially after Robert the Bruce's triumph at Bannockburn. Yet, victory didn't erase old rivalries. Instead, it left a patchwork kingdom where local lords and clans were often more loyal to their kin than to their king. Highland chiefs and Lowland nobles followed their own codes, sometimes cooperating, sometimes clashing. The monarchy might issue decrees from Edinburgh, but out in the glens and on the isles, real power lay with the clans who ruled their own people with iron authority. These rivalries could spark from almost anything: a stolen cow, an insult at a gathering, or a marriage alliance gone sour. A feud between two clans might simmer for years, breaking out in sudden raids. Highland glens became battlegrounds as men marched under their clan banners, wielding broadswords and targes, shields painted with bold patterns. Cattle, the true measure of wealth in many parts of Scotland, were often the prize. To raid a rival's herds wasn't just theft, it was an attack on their honour, demanding revenge. Take the feud between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald, one of the most infamous in Scottish history. Their animosity would stretch on for centuries, fueled by both politics and personal vendettas. These were not minor skirmishes, but bloody confrontations that left villages burned and families shattered. And they weren't alone. Clan Gordon clashed with Clan Forbes, while the Mackays, MacLeods, and countless others had their own endless cycle of feud and counterfeud. The idea of peace was always temporary, a brief pause before the next storm. Kings tried to bring order, of course. The Stewart dynasty, eager to strengthen royal power, issued edicts and tried to rein in the worst offenders. Sometimes they summoned clan leaders to court, demanding oaths of loyalty. Other times they sent armies to punish rebels, but enforcing peace in the Highlands was like trying to hold back the tide. The terrain itself worked against authority mountains, lochs and forests, gave clans the ability to resist and survive, even when the crown bore down on them. Religion, too, added layers of division. Christianity had long united Scotland in faith, but rival loyalties to church figures or monasteries could deepen disputes. Some clans prided themselves on their support of certain abbeys, while others fought to control church lands and tithes. It wasn't always about belief, it was about power, and in medieval Scotland, power was the lifeblood of rivalry. The constant feuding took a toll on ordinary people. Farmers in the Highlands lived in constant uncertainty. Would the harvest be taken by raiders? Would their homes be torched in the night? Women and children bore the brunt of instability, forced to rebuild again and again. Even in the Lowlands, where towns were growing and trade was stronger, the ripple of clan conflict often reached marketplaces and roads. Peace was never guaranteed. Yet, strangely, these rivalries also shaped Scottish identity. Clans became symbols of loyalty, pride, and belonging. To belong to a clan was to have a place in a story that stretched back generations. People wore tartans, carried crests, and honoured ancestors who had fought for their name. These rivalries gave Scotland its fierce sense of kinship, even as they tore the land apart. When outside threats appeared, however, those same clans could sometimes set aside their feuds. English invasions or Viking raids reminded them that survival required unity. But the moment the danger passed, old wounds reopened. It was as if Scotland lived with two identities, one kingdom under a crown, and dozens of clans, each guarding their own world. This delicate balance between fragile peace and explosive rivalry would define Scotland for centuries. It explains why kings struggled to impose authority, why castles were both refuges and targets, and why alliances were so fleeting. As we move forward, we'll see how these rivalries didn't just shape politics, but also left scars on Scotland's culture, stories, and memory. Peace in medieval Scotland was always a dream within reach, yet never fully grasped, because behind every handshake lay the shadow of an unsheathed sword, the Stewart dynasty. From Robert II to expanding royal power, picture a kingdom battered by wars of independence, scarred by endless clan feuds, yet still clinging to its identity. Out of this turmoil, in the year 1371, a new line of rulers took the throne, the Stuarts. They would hold the Scottish crown for over 3 centuries, weaving their names so tightly into the nation's story that even today it echoes through history. But their beginning was far humbler than the grandeur they would later claim. The first Stuart king, Robert II, wasn't a bold warrior like Robert the Bruce or a fiery rebel like William Wallace. He was cautious, sometimes indecisive, but he had something just as important: legitimacy. He was the grandson of Robert the Bruce through his daughter Marjorie. And when David II, Bruce's son, died childless, the crown passed to Robert II. That bloodline was the key, and it placed the Stuarts firmly on the throne. The name Stewart itself came from the title of High Steward of Scotland, an office once held by Robert's ancestors. They were originally administrators, keepers of the king's household and finances. Imagine that a family of royal officials rising step by step until they became kings themselves. It was a dynasty born not from sudden conquest, but from steady service, clever marriages, and patient accumulation of influence. Robert II's reign was not without problems. Clan rivalries flared, and his authority was often challenged by his own sons. But his rule planted the seed of continuity. Scotland, exhausted by the upheavals of the 14th century, finally had a royal family that could last. And his successors would prove far more assertive than he ever was. His son, Robert III, was plagued by misfortune, crippled by an accident, mocked for weakness, and overshadowed by stronger nobles. His reign nearly tore the kingdom apart. His eldest son, the Duke of Rothesay, died mysteriously, likely murdered in a web of power struggles. Fearing for his younger son James, Robert III sent the boy away to France. But fate was cruel. On the voyage, young James was captured by the English and held prisoner. Robert III, broken by the loss, is said to have declared himself the worst of kings and the most miserable of men. Yet out of this tragedy came one of Scotland's most remarkable rulers, James I. When he was finally released after long years in English captivity, he returned hardened, educated, and determined to assert his authority. He slashed at corruption, reformed finances, and reined in unruly lords. But his iron hand bred resentment. In 1437, he was assassinated in a brutal plot, stabbed dozens of times by conspirators who thought they could break royal power. Instead, the Stuart dynasty only grew stronger. James II came next, remembered for his violent temper and the infamous Black Dinner, a bloody betrayal of the powerful Douglas family. James III pursued art and architecture, but alienated his nobles. Then came James IV, one of the most charismatic Stuarts. He spoke many languages, encouraged learning, built ships, and tried to stand toe-to-toe with England. His ambition, though, led to disaster at Flodden in 1513, where he became the last British monarch to die in battle. But the line endured. James V carried the torch. Though his reign was troubled, and his death left the crown to his infant daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. That, of course, is a story filled with romance and tragedy one will unravel later. What matters here is that through triumphs and disasters alike, the Stuarts clung to power. Their dynasty wasn't fragile like so many others. It adapted, survived, and kept expanding its authority. And expansion mattered. With each generation, the monarchy pulled more power into its orbit, often at the expense of fractious lords. Castles became not just strongholds of clans, but symbols of royal might. Parliaments were called, taxes imposed, alliances forged with France and other nations. The Stuarts were not just kings of Scotland, They were shaping Scotland into a stronger kingdom itself, one that could eventually stand on equal terms with its neighbours. Do you remember when we spoke of castles as symbols of pride and politics? Under the Stuarts, this was truer than ever. Stirling, Edinburgh, Linlithgow, these places became more than fortresses. They were the stage sets of royal power, projecting the image of a dynasty that was here to stay. By the time of the Union of the Crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne, the Stuarts had risen from humble stewards to rulers of two kingdoms. It was the ultimate expansion of their power, a union that would reshape not just Scotland, but all of Britain. The Stuarts' story was one of endurance through chaos, a dynasty that began in the shadow of Robert the Bruce and ended on the grand stage of European monarchy. They were cunning, flawed, often tragic, but always central to the heartbeat of Scotland. And their rise reminds us that power is never built in a single moment of glory. It is built, step by step, across generations, castles as symbols, strongholds of war, pride, and politics. Imagine standing in the shadow of a massive stone fortress, its towers rising against the sky, banners fluttering in the wind, and the sound of hooves echoing across the drawbridge. To the medieval Scot, a castle wasn't just a building. It was a message carved in stone, a declaration of power, protection, and pride. Every wall told you who ruled here, who defended it, and who dared challenge it. Before the age of castles, Scotland's lords and kings relied on wooden forts or hilltop duns. They were strong in their own way, but they couldn't match the sheer dominance of stone. The first great wave of castles came with the Normans, who introduced their fortress designs in the 12th century. Suddenly, the landscape bristled with strongholds, motte and bailey at first, then mighty keeps of stone that could withstand fire, arrows and sieges. Think of Edinburgh Castle perched on its volcanic rock, or Stirling Castle guarding the crossing of the River Forth. These weren't just military bases, they were statements. Whoever held them could control the land around them. They were political chess pieces, shifting back and forth during wars and rebellions, each change of hands rewriting the story of Scotland's struggle for power. Castles weren't only about war, though, they were about identity. A clan chief who built a castle showed that he wasn't just a warrior, but a leader worthy of loyalty and respect. For kings, castles anchored their authority across the realm, tying distant regions more firmly to the crown. That's why you'll find so many scattered across the Highlands and Lowlands, each one a reminder that power wasn't abstract, it was physical, looming over villages and fields. Inside the walls, life was more than swords and shields. Banquets filled the great halls, with music, feasting, and alliances being forged over wine and roasted meat. Courtyards bustled with craftsmen, servants, and traders. For ordinary people living outside the walls, a castle was both a refuge in times of danger and a symbol of the burdens they carried: taxes, labour, and service owed to the lord within. Of course, castles were also magnets for conflict. During the Wars of Independence, they became prime targets. Remember Stirling Castle? It stood at the heart of Scotland's fight for freedom, changing hands between Scots and English as if the stone itself couldn't decide who it belonged to. The Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where William Wallace struck his famous blow, was fought with that castle looming nearby. Later, Robert the Bruce himself ordered many castles destroyed, not out of spite, but as a deliberate strategy. He knew that if the English couldn't occupy them, they couldn't use them as footholds against Scotland. Over time, castles also turned into symbols of pride rather than just fortresses of war. By the Stewart dynasty, many were rebuilt into grand residences. Towers became palaces, with stained glass, tapestries and gardens softening their harsh edges. They still had their defences, of course, but they also spoke of culture, wealth, and royal ambition. A castle now told visitors, "Here is not just a fighter, but a king who belongs on the European stage." Castles also carried deep political weight. To gift a castle was to give trust and power. To seize one was to strip away honour and control. They became bargaining chips in treaties, dowries in royal marriages, and prizes in civil wars. Holding a castle wasn't just about bricks and mortar, it was about legitimacy. To stand behind its walls was to declare, "I belong here, I rule here." Even today, the ruins of these castles feel alive with echoes of that past. Walk through the remains of Dunatar clinging to its cliff, or gaze at the lonely towers of Urquhart on Loch Ness, and you can almost hear the clash of steel, the whispers of council meetings, or the songs of celebration. They are memories in stone, telling Scotland's story of resilience and pride. And remember, castles were never isolated. They were tied to every thread of Scotland's history, to Viking raids that first inspired stronger defences, to Norman lords who introduced their designs, to Wallace and Bruce who fought for their control, and to the Stewart kings who transformed them into palaces of culture. Each stone is part of a much bigger picture, one we've been weaving together as we move through Scotland's medieval story. In the end, castles were more than fortresses. They were mirrors of Scotland itself, strong, stubborn, scarred by battles, but also proud, beautiful, and enduring. And even centuries later they still stand, watching over the land like silent guardians, reminding us of the struggles, ambitions, and dreams of those who once called them home. Anglo-Scottish conflicts. Flodden and the cost of ambition. Picture a late summer day in the year 1513. The air is heavy with the smell of damp earth and tension. On the rolling fields near Flodden in Northumberland, two armies stare each other down, the English on one side, the Scots on the other. It is here that one of the darkest days in Scottish history would unfold, a tragedy born of ambition, pride, and the never-ending struggle between two neighbouring kingdoms. To understand Flodden, you have to step back a little. Scotland and England were bound together by centuries of rivalry. Borders were never quiet. Raids, skirmishes, and power plays were almost constant. Yet politics of the wider world often dragged Scotland into conflicts that stretched far beyond the borderlands. In this case, it was Scotland's alliance with France, the Old Alliance. When Henry VIII of England went to war against France, Scotland was obliged to act. James IV of Scotland, a bold and ambitious king, saw his moment. By attacking England while Henry was abroad, he could honour his alliance with France and maybe even expand Scotland's influence. James was no ordinary monarch. He was charismatic, well-educated, and deeply respected by his people. But he was also driven by pride, the kind that sometimes blinds even the wisest of rulers. In deciding to march south, he gambled not only his own life, but the fate of his kingdom. Gathering one of the largest Scottish armies ever seen, James crossed the border into England, taking castles and burning villages. It must have felt like destiny was in his grasp. But the English weren't helpless. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's formidable queen, took command in her husband's absence, rallying English forces to meet the Scots. At Flodden Field, the two sides clashed. The Scots had the advantage of numbers and position. They also wielded long pikes, weapons inspired by continental warfare. Yet what looked strong on paper unravelled in the chaos of battle. The ground was wet and uneven, bogging down the Scottish advance. English billhooks shorter, brutal weapons tore through the long pikes, dragging men down into the mud. The fighting was savage, close, and merciless, and in the heart of it, King James himself fought. Unlike many kings who hung back, James led from the front, charging into the thick of combat. It was brave, perhaps even heroic, but also fatal. By the end of the day, he lay dead on the field, the last monarch from the British Isles ever to die in battle. Around him were the bodies of his nobles, bishops, and thousands of his men. Scotland had suffered not just a defeat, but a catastrophe. The aftermath was devastating. With so many leaders killed, Scotland was left politically shaken, vulnerable, and grieving. James's young son, barely a child, inherited the throne as James V, leaving the kingdom in the hands of regents. The dream of glory had turned into a nightmare. Flodden became a wound that lingered in the Scottish memory for generations, a symbol of what unchecked ambition could cost. And yet, even in tragedy, something endures. The Scots mourned, but they also remembered the courage of their king and the men who fell with him. Songs and poems kept their names alive. The sense of national identity, far from broken, grew stronger. Defeat did not erase the spirit of independence. If anything, it deepened the conviction that Scotland would not vanish. No matter how heavy the losses, Flodden stands as one of those turning points where history could have gone another way. Had James held back, had the terrain favoured the Scots, perhaps the story would be different. But history is made of choices and chances, and on that September day, the cost of ambition was paid in blood. When you think of the long line of Anglo-Scottish conflicts from early raids to the great wars of independence, Flodden remains one of the most haunting chapters, not just because of the scale of the loss, but because it revealed the thin line between triumph and disaster. One king's bold gamble reshaped a nation's fate, and in the misty fields where thousands once fell, the echoes of that day still whisper of pride, courage, and the terrible price of war. Everyday life. Farmers, craftsmen, and the burden of survival. When you think of medieval Scotland, it's easy to picture kings, castles, and great battles like Bannockburn. But for most people, life wasn't about thrones or wars. It was about survival. The ordinary men and women who lived in tiny villages, who worked the soil with blistered hands, who made tools and clothes, who prayed for good weather and feared the long winters, they are the ones who truly carried Scotland on their backs. Imagine waking up in a small wooden hut with a thatched roof. The floor is packed earth, and smoke from the hearth hangs in the air because there's no chimney. You sleep on straw, maybe with a blanket if you're lucky, and your whole family, sometimes even the animals, shares the same space. That was the reality for most farmers, the backbone of medieval life. Their days began at dawn and ended at dusk, always dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. The land was everything. Farmers grew barley and oats, hardy grains that could withstand Scotland's unpredictable climate. They kept cows for milk, sheep for wool, and chickens for eggs. But nothing was guaranteed. A single bad harvest meant hunger, too much rain, or too little, and the community would suffer. You can almost feel the constant anxiety of depending on the sky for survival. And when famine struck, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was life or death. Craftsmen had a slightly different role, but their lives weren't much easier. Blacksmiths forged nails, tools, and horseshoes, often working with fire and iron in cramped workshops. Carpenters shaped wood into carts, doors, and furniture. Weavers and spinners turned wool into clothing. These weren't glamorous trades, but without them, society would collapse. Every village needed a smith, a miller, someone who knew how to build or repair. Their work gave structure to daily life. Religion was woven deeply into this world. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was the center of community life. Priests offered blessings for crops, heard confessions, and reminded people of the promise of heaven, which must have been a comfort when earthly life was so harsh. Festivals tied to the Christian calendar brought brief moments of joy, with feasts, dancing, and gatherings that broke the monotony of work. Saints' days, Christmas, and Easter were more than religious events. They were a chance to feel part of something larger. And yet, beyond the village, dangers always loomed. Raids from rival clans, harsh taxes from lords, or demands from kings could turn survival into despair. When we think of castles, we often imagine them as romantic strongholds, but for common people, they were reminders of power. Lords could demand service, food, or labor at any time. The weight of survival was not just physical, but social. You weren't only fighting nature, you were also navigating the demands of those above you. Still, there was resilience. Villages worked together, families supported each other, and traditions kept spirits alive. Storytelling by the fire passed down history and legend. Songs and music lifted hearts, even in the darkest times. A farmer might spend the day bent over the fields, but in the evening he might laugh with neighbours, share ale, and feel part of a community bound together by hardship. It's important to remember that these everyday lives shaped the nation just as much as the kings. Without farmers feeding armies, without craftsmen forging weapons, without families enduring, there would have been no great battles to win, no dynasties to rule, no Scotland at all. Even Robert the Bruce, victorious at Bannockburn, relied on the toil of ordinary people to sustain his cause. When we later talk about the Highlands versus the Lowlands, you'll see how geography influenced everyday survival even further. Rugged mountains, creating one kind of life, fertile plains another. But at its core, medieval existence everywhere in Scotland was about the same fragile balance. Enough food, enough shelter, and enough hope to make it through another year. So, while history often shines its light on crowns and castles, the real story of medieval Scotland was written in the soil, in the workshops, and in the hearts of its people. Every loaf of bread, every woven cloak, every stone wall built by hand, was a quiet act of endurance. Survival wasn't glorious, but it was the foundation upon which everything else stood. The Highlands versus the Lowlands, two worlds in one nation. Close your eyes and picture Scotland. What do you see? For some, it's misty glens, rugged mountains, and lone castles perched above dark lochs. For others, it's rolling farmland, bustling burghs, and stone bridges crossing quiet rivers. Both images are true, but they belong to two very different Scotlands. The Highlands and the Lowlands were more than just regions on a map. They were worlds apart, divided by geography, culture, language, and even outlook on life. And yet, together, They made up one nation. The Highlands stretched across the north and west, a landscape carved by glaciers and ruled by nature's extremes. Mountains rose like walls, isolating valleys where clans lived in tight-knit communities. Travel was difficult. The soil often poor, and survival depended on herding cattle and fishing the seas. This harsh land bred a fierce independence. Here, loyalty was personal to family, to kin, to clan. Chiefs were not distant figures of authority. They were protectors, leaders, and, when necessary, warriors. The Lowlands, in contrast, opened gently toward England and the wider world. Rich farmland supported agriculture on a larger scale, and towns began to flourish. Burghs like Edinburgh, Stirling, and Glasgow bustled with trade, markets, and merchants. The people here spoke Scots, a Germanic tongue influenced by English and Norse, while the Highlands held on to Gaelic. Where Highlanders measured wealth in cattle and kinship ties, Lowlanders counted it in coin, crops, and charters. This divide wasn't just about economy or language, it shaped identity. In the Highlands, culture was oral, rooted in stories, songs, and traditions passed from generation to generation. Bards kept history alive around the fire, and clans measured their strength by the bravery of their warriors. In the Lowlands, literacy and administration grew faster, with charters, law courts, and written records binding society. It was almost as if the two regions looked in opposite directions. The Highlands inward to clan and tradition, the Lowlands outward to trade and politics. Conflict often grew from this difference. Kings ruling from lowland centres struggled to impose authority in the Highlands. Royal decrees could be read out in Edinburgh, but enforcing them in a remote glen of Skye or Lochaber was another matter entirely. Many Highland chiefs valued their independence too much to obey a distant monarch. To the crown, they could look like rebels. To their people, they were simply doing what chiefs had always done, defending clan freedom. Yet, despite the divides, the two regions were deeply intertwined. When English armies marched north, Highland and Lowland warriors often stood shoulder to shoulder, even if they mistrusted one another. The wars of independence, with figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, drew men from both worlds into the fight. Remember Bannockburn? That victory was possible because Scots of every stripe rallied together against a common foe. Unity could be found in moments of crisis, even if daily life kept them apart. Marriage alliances also bridged the gap. Lowland nobles often married into Highland clans, creating networks of kinship that crossed cultural lines. Trade between the regions, cattle driven from Highland pastures to Lowland markets, kept goods and stories flowing. Even the church played a role, as monasteries and abbeys dotted both Highlands and Lowlands, spreading Christianity and a sense of shared faith. Still, tensions never truly disappeared. Lowlanders sometimes looked at Highlanders as backward, wild, even dangerous. Highlanders, in turn, saw Lowlanders as soft, foreign-influenced, and too quick to bow to English ways. These prejudices could flare into violence when politics or feuds erupted. It was an uneasy coexistence, a reminder that Scotland's unity was always fragile. Yet out of this divide came a richness that defined Scotland itself. The poetry of the Lowlands and the songs of the Highlands, the bustling markets of burghs and the lonely beauty of glens together, they created a nation both diverse and resilient. One side gave Scotland its connection to Europe and the wider world, the other its fierce traditions and unbreakable spirit. As the centuries moved on, the contrast between Highlands and Lowlands would only grow sharper, influencing everything from politics to identity. But in the medieval world, this duality was Scotland's strength as much as its weakness. Two worlds, one nation forever pulling apart, yet bound by a shared fate. And as we keep following Scotland's story, this push and pull between Highlands and Lowlands will remain at the heart of everything. Mary, Queen of Scots, romance, intrigue, and tragedy. Few figures in Scottish history capture the imagination like Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a queen at just 6 days old, a bride before her teens, and by her mid-20s, a widow, a prisoner, and a woman caught in a storm of politics, passion, and betrayal. Her life played out like a tragic play romance, intrigue and heartbreak woven into every chapter. Mary was born in December 1542, the only surviving legitimate child of James V of Scotland. Her father died almost immediately after her birth, leaving the crown on the head of a fragile infant. Scotland was thrown into uncertainty, and rival factions jostled for power in her name. The English king, Henry VIII, tried to secure her hand for his son Edward, hoping to bind Scotland and England through marriage. But the Scots resisted, and the so-called rough wooing brought years of brutal war. To keep her safe, Mary was sent across the sea to France. Imagine her as a little girl, leaving the wild coasts of Scotland behind for the glittering courts of Renaissance Europe. In France, she was raised like a princess of fairy tales, educated, elegant, fluent in languages, and married to the young Dauphin Francis. When Francis became king, Mary was Queen Consort of France, as well as Queen of Scotland. For a moment, it seemed her destiny would be golden. But fate was cruel. Francis died young, and Mary, still only a teenager, found herself a widow. The French court no longer needed her, and so she returned to Scotland in 1561. Picture the contrast, the grand palaces of France replaced by the raw, wind-battered castles of her homeland. She brought with her French grace and Catholic faith, stepping into a kingdom that was fractious, deeply Protestant, and suspicious of foreign influence. Mary tried to rule with balance. She showed tolerance for Protestants, kept a regal composure, and for a time won admiration. But her personal life soon became a battlefield as dangerous as any war. Her second marriage, to her cousin Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, was a disaster. At first, Darnley seemed a fitting match, handsome, with royal blood, but he was arrogant, violent, and quickly fell out with Mary and her advisers. Then came the scandal that would haunt her forever. In 1566, her secretary, David Rizzio, was dragged from her chamber and murdered by Darnley and his allies, while Mary, pregnant with her son, was forced to watch. It was a shocking act of brutality, one that shattered any pretense of stability at her court. Not long after, Darnley himself was killed in mysterious circumstances. A house explosion followed by his strangled body found in a garden. Suspicion swirled, and though no proof ever convicted her, many believed Mary was complicit, or at least turned a blind eye. The truth remains a mystery, but in the eyes of her enemies, her reputation was blackened forever. Her third marriage sealed her downfall. She wed James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a man accused of orchestrating Darnley's murder. Whether Mary was coerced, trapped, or genuinely in love is still debated. But to the Scottish nobles, This was intolerable. They rose against her, captured her at Carberry Hill, and forced her to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James VI. Mary, the crowned queen, was now a prisoner. She escaped once, rallied supporters, and fought a brief battle at Langside. Defeated, she fled south, seeking refuge with her cousin, Elizabeth I of England. But Elizabeth was not the saviour Mary hoped for. Instead, she became a captive once again, this time in England, where she would remain for nearly 20 years. During those years, Mary's very existence was a threat. To English Catholics, she was the rightful queen, the symbol of resistance against Protestant Elizabeth. Plots and conspiracies formed around her, some with her knowledge, others without. Eventually, Elizabeth had enough. In 1587, after the Babington plot was uncovered, Mary was tried for treason. The verdict was death. Her execution was as dramatic as her life. Dressed in red, the colour of martyrdom, she faced the axe with dignity. Witnesses described her prayers, her steady courage, and the shocking sight when her head was lifted, her auburn wig slipping from the executioner's hand to reveal greying hair. It was the final, tragic scene of a life filled with drama. And yet, Mary's story didn't end there. Her son, James VI of Scotland, eventually became James I of England, uniting the crowns that Mary had once dreamed of joining. In death, she achieved what she never could in life, the merging of two kingdoms. Mary, Queen of Scots, remains a figure both romantic and tragic. She was not perfect. She made mistakes, sometimes reckless ones. But she was also a woman born into an impossible role, trying to navigate love, power, and survival in a world that gave her little chance. Her story is one of beauty and sorrow, a tale that still fascinates because it feels less like dry history and more like the drama of a living heart. The Union of the Crowns. Medieval Scotland meets modern Britain. Picture the year 1603. The streets of Edinburgh buzz with rumour, the bells of street. Giles toll in anticipation, and a single question echoes everywhere. What happens now that Scotland and England share the same king? After centuries of wars, rivalries, and uneasy truces, the unthinkable had happened. The crowns of two old enemies rested on one head. The story begins with Elizabeth I of England. She ruled with power and brilliance, but she left one enormous problem: no children. When she died in March of 1603, the English throne was suddenly vacant. The closest heir wasn't English at all, but Scottish James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Overnight, James became James I of England. A single king now ruled two kingdoms that had fought each other for generations. But here's the twist. This wasn't a full union of nations, only a union of crowns. Scotland and England kept their own parliaments, laws and churches. They weren't one country, but they were bound together by a monarch who wore two crowns. Imagine the balancing act for James to rule England, with its wealth and powerful nobles, while still keeping faith with Scotland, his homeland that had raised and shaped him. For Scots, the reaction was mixed. Some saw opportunity. England was larger, richer, and more connected to Europe. A shared king could mean peace, trade, and influence. Others felt suspicion, even betrayal. Had Scotland, proud and independent, suddenly become a junior partner in a marriage it never chose? Old memories of battles like Flodden and Bannockburn made many wary of being swallowed up by their southern neighbour. James himself had dreams bigger than either kingdom. He spoke of a Great Britain, a united island under one crown, one flag, and one identity. He even designed a new coin, showing a rose and a thistle growing from the same stem. But while the idea was bold, the reality was far harder. English and Scottish parliaments resisted full union, clinging tightly to their traditions and independence. The people weren't ready to erase centuries of rivalry with the wave of a royal hand. Still, the union of crowns changed daily life in subtle but powerful ways. The border, once a lawless zone of raids and battles, slowly quieted. Families who had lived in fear of English or Scottish soldiers now found new stability. Trade increased, roads connected, and for the first time in generations, peace felt possible. Edinburgh remained the heart of Scotland, but London now pulled at its king, drawing James southward into a world of wealth and grandeur. And yet, Scotland did not vanish into England's shadow. Its church, fiercely Presbyterian, stood apart from the Anglican system of bishops. Its laws and courts remained distinct. If anything, Scots clung more tightly to their identity, aware that sharing a king meant they had to work harder to keep their own voice. It was a tension that would never fully disappear. The union also cast a long shadow over politics. When James's son, Charles I, clashed with both his English and Scottish subjects, those tensions erupted into wars that shook the kingdoms. Later, in the 17th century, the question of how far this union should go would ignite fierce debate, rebellions, and eventually lead to the Act of Union itself in the early 18th century. But that's another story, one that builds directly on the foundations laid in 1603. Think back to Mary, Queen of Scots, executed by Elizabeth after a life of intrigue and tragedy. Ironically, it was Mary's son who inherited both thrones, uniting the realms that had destroyed her. History has a strange sense of poetry, doesn't it? For Scotland, the union of the crowns was the bridge between the medieval world of clans, castles, and endless wars, and the modern Britain that would dominate global politics in the centuries to come. It didn't erase Scotland's past, but it pulled the nation onto a new stage. Standing at that moment in history, you can almost feel the weight of possibility. Would Scotland gain strength through unity, or lose itself in the shadow of its neighbour? That question hung heavy then, and in many ways it still echoes today. What began with James riding south to claim the throne of England was more than just the story of one king. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where medieval Scotland stepped into the uncertain light of modern Britain. From Celtic clans to towering castles and fierce battles, the story of medieval Scotland is a saga of courage, struggle, and identity. These kings and warriors didn't just fight for land. They carved the spirit of a nation that still echoes today. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video, drop a comment with your favourite part, and subscribe for more epic history brought to life.